Welcome to the first group IDI debriefing video for the Intercultural Pedagogy Grant Workshop. In this video series, we will be looking at the theoretical framework behind the IDI, as well as the results for the participants in this year's IPG. Before we begin, this would be a good time to take out a piece of paper to take some notes. Think of any comments or questions that you might have during the video that you might want to bring up in the first workshop. Please note, there will be instructions about next steps at the end of each video. Let's begin by discussing the importance of developing intercultural competence. Research shows that developing intercultural competence affects the following four areas: increasing knowledge and interest in other cultures, lowering intercultural anxiety, developing more intercultural friendships, as well as feeling greater satisfaction with intercultural experiences. The more important question, however, is, why is it important for you to be more interculturally competent? At this point, I would like you to stop and reflect on how developing your own intercultural competence will be important to you. Consider these areas. Professionally, working with others cooperatively is a necessity. As a program leader, you will be better equipped to serve your students. Lastly, as a global citizen, you will experience greater enjoyment with intercultural interactions. Now let's turn our attention to the theoretical framework behind the IDI. This framework is a continuum that measures monocultural to intercultural mindsets. Along the scale, there are 5 distinct stages or orientations to difference. The first stage is denial. At this stage, people tend to have limited experience with cultural difference and often miss significant differences. They instead tend to focus on broad stereotypes and generalizations. Typically, denial manifests itself in one of two ways, either disinterest or avoidance. In avoidance, given the choice, they will almost always opt to interact with someone similar to themselves over people who are different. With disinterest, they tend to ignore or be disinterested in what those differences are. The next orientation is polarization. Someone in polarization tends to view things as us versus them. In this instance, they are subjectively judging differences. This orientation manifests itself in 2 different ways as well: defense or reversal. Defense polarization is defensive of one's own culture. This also means they are overly critical of the other culture. Reversal polarization is exactly that, the opposite. To be overly critical of one's own culture in favor of the other. Often, someone can be polarized about a particular aspect of culture in a particular context or a particular situation. The main thing to take away from polarization is that there is a judgmental hierarchical mentality in which one culture is better than the other. The next orientation is minimization. At this stage, we tend to de-emphasize difference. We recognize that there are cultural differences just as we do in polarization. However, now we are judging those differences more objectively. As the name implies, we minimize these differences, considering them less important than similarity. What we have in common as human beings tends to be the central focus. We are all human, we all need to eat, drink, sleep, have loving relationships, and have a good job. Working from that basis, we can get along with anyone. This also highlights what tends to be the focus of minimization: getting along. How can I get along with others and avoid conflict? For this reason, minimization tends to be a stage where people tend to linger or stall in their intercultural development. The next orientation is acceptance. At this stage, we begin to deeply comprehend differences that we noticed in polarization and minimization. However, now we are beginning to recognize that those differences are equally important to things that make us similar. At the acceptance stage, we are beginning to bring into equilibrium the importance of similarity and difference. I would also like to point out that this necessitates cultural knowledge acquisition. You have to actually know specific things about the culture to reach acceptance. And for this reason, I often see this stage of development as including a threshold between the first 3 stages and the final 2, a threshold of knowledge. Work has to be done to learn about the specifics of a culture. This likewise means that we can only attain acceptance if we look at individual cultures one at a time. We can very rarely gain an orientation of acceptance with multiple cultures simultaneously. The final orientation is adaptation. This is a stage that is defined by a distinct behavioral change, bridging across difference. So not only do we have a deep understanding of what makes us different, brought into equilibrium with similarity, but now we are beginning to change our own behaviors to accommodate those in the other culture. We are applying our own cultural knowledge appropriately. This does not, however, mean that we have abandoned our own identities or our own cultural values. Rather, we are changing our behaviors in a way that is similar to the way that locals or members of that community would behave, in an effort to meet their cultural expectations. On this slide, we get a better idea of how each of these orientations fit within the continuum itself. Not everyone will progress through all 5 stages, from the monocultural mindset to the intercultural mindset, but when someone does progress through the continuum, they progress in the same direction and in the same order. It is also important to point out that this is a developmental model and not a good or bad binary model. Everyone develops in different ways because everyone has a different lived experience. There are a number of variables that come into play in our development along the continuum. These are things such as number of interactions, frequency, intensity, duration, whether those interactions have been good, bad, or neutral. And finally, we need to understand that our own cultural values and worldview influence the way we process and understand these experiences. These factors determine the rate and extent to which we develop along this continuum. The results show precisely where you should be on the continuum based on your experiences. It would be incorrect to apply the binary model of good or bad. Someone who is in the stage of denial is not a bad person. There are people in denial who are wonderful human beings, but may not have had as many or as intense or as frequently good experiences as others. Likewise, there are people in adaptation who, let's face it, are manipulative jerks. The IDI provides no insight into whether a person is good or bad, only where they are in their intercultural development. We cannot apply a good or bad judgment to one's orientation along this continuum. It simply does not make sense. This is the end of video 1. Return to the IPG Blackboard site to access the link for video 2. Please continue to take notes during the next video.